After I did the show for a while, I realized that the show was successful, and that this particular character, Quentin, you know, you began to have a feeling of, or a wonderment of, because that was the nature of the beast, I think, is this character getting across to the people who are watching it? Are they going to like him? And then it becomes, are they going to like me? You start taking it all personally. Then a lot of letters started coming into the studio. I mean, just tons of letters. I mean, thousands of letters for Quentin, and as such, David Selby, who was playing the role. So many, in fact, that I found I was overwhelmed by that. And they didn't even give them to me. I mean, they just, I remember seeing tons of boxes and boxes full. And I began to sense that, oh my goodness, the character was getting successful. And about that time, I think my contract had been up, and Dan just was renewing it. So then I knew that, oh, hey. And of course, then 16 Magazine came in. And when 16 Magazine, Gloria Stavers came aboard and started taking so many pictures and calling me, and I started doing all of this publicity for the show via 16 Magazine and all that. Then I began to realize that because they told me, basically, that a lot of fans, that the character had, that Quentin had a lot of fans across the country. And that was, I must say, that was quite special. And I can't say that I didn't enjoy that. I did very much so. I enjoyed, enjoyed that. I mean, who wouldn't, in that sense? So that was all quite good. And the fact that the storyline, going back to the past and all of that, was quite significant rating-wise, was also, you know, good. Not just for me personally, but it was a rewarding time to do that, and to realize that people were turning in to watch. And then that when you walked outside the studio, you'd always have a whole contingent of fans watching you, and all of that was new. And then I'd go home. I lived in a one-bedroom, two-room apartment up on 74th Street in the West Side at that time. And I would go and do these things like, oh, I Am an American Day Parade in New York, or I'd appear here, or I remember traveling up, I believe, to Boston or Maine, somewhere up in there, and doing various things at that time, and even going out in public, going to a theater. I remember going to see, was it Cabaret or some show back during that time, and walking into the theater. It was a Broadway house, and literally people applauding. And you have that total ignorance of what's going on, and then you realize, and then you just are embarrassed, and then, but after you leave or whatever, you're sort of saying, gee whiz, that's all right, all right. And then you go home to your two-room apartment, and there's something wrong with this picture here, and I should, you know, that's so there was all of that, and it took a while. And then, of course, your parents back home, and all your relatives and your friends, and of course, I heard from a lot of them, and I can imagine that during that particular time that they'd watch it, and they'd probably are saying, "Oh my God, do you know who that is?" and that whole thing. So there was a sense of joy about all of that. I can recall having, you know, people were always jumping into cabs with me. You know, I'd be forced to take a cab. I didn't live too far from the studio at that time, but the fans were so voracious or whatever, exuberant, and just loved to walk with you or whatever. And if you would I can remember hopping into the cab and having 3 or 4 jumping into the cab with me, you know, and then I'd, you know, or walking home, it was like a Pied Piper. And I actually had a few actually asked that camped out in the lobby of my little building, and I just had lived in a brownstone, so it wasn't any great lobby or anything like that, but they had asked me to, if I would adopt them. And that was true, and so we had to call the family court and do things like that. And of course, I remember mentioning one of the things, and I've mentioned this before, some of the things that it was of its time. And it was the late 60s, during that time, 68, 69, 70. And I got so many peace beads, thousands of peace beads, and I wondered, I should have kept them, but I gave everything, I gave all those gifts away. And I could remember, they gave you just such, some were quite simple, but some were elaborate or whatever, but they were all of that period of the late 60s. And I remember, and I've mentioned this before, I happened to mention that I liked Sara Lee banana cake, somewhere in 16 magazine, I believe, or one of those magazines. There was Tiger Bee, there were several. And ABC at that time, we were bombarded with Sara Lee banana cakes. It just would start. So all that, and I used to get tons of stuffed animals. I loved that, and I would take them up. At that time, there was a housing up at Lincoln Center, the Lincoln Center complex up in there. You could take things up there, and I donated all of that. I constantly taking loads of things up there like that. It was all delightful. The sideburns, I have no idea whose initial idea that was, whether it could have been Dan's for all I know. It could have been Vinny, the makeup man, or I don't know where the initial idea came from. Maybe I had a thought about mutton chops, but we had these two sort of obviously fake mutton chops, and I was trying to grow my own real ones under that. So we'd go in, and Vinny would glue these mutton chops onto my beard that I was growing, and every day having to pull that. But eventually I was able to grow enough, and we could pencil it in a little bit. I never was able to grow a great beard anyway, but those turned out, and so I eventually grew my own. And I was amazed at the number of people around the country who would write, and as letters I read, that they had grown their mutton chops too, and I sort of like that, or women who had named their babies Quentin. So that was all right, but I kept those. Then I had to cut them again because I started doing a lot of theater. So, and then I had to go back to, but anyway. As I say, I was raised in West Virginia, Morgantown, West Virginia, and had always sort of, I don't know, I was always dreaming, about various things and what I could do. I think eventually, at first, because I wanted to be a rock and roll star or whatever, I was always dreaming those kinds of things. I go to movies by myself. I remember going to see Gone with the Wind by myself. But I met a man when I was a freshman or sophomore in college, and he said, "Why don't you take an acting class?" And he was my advisor. And I was in trouble academically anyway at that time, and I thought, well, I don't know. And he said, "Can I get a good grade or something?" He says, "Well, you look like you could." Anyway, I took the class and never looked back. I enjoyed it so much. Then I started being in the university, I started participating in the university plays that they had. I believe the first thing I did was a musical, Brigadoon, and now will you come to Sandy's booth, come over to Sandy's booth, it's a delightful musical, actually. And then I did Oklahoma, played Will Parker. It was a musical. Everything's up to date in Kansas City. They're going about as far as they can go. They went and built a skyscraper 7 stories high, about as high as a building ought to grow, and then all of that. And then I started doing, I did a comedy role, Mr. Roberts, Ensign Pulver, and I loved it. And that was, I don't know, the turning, and I said, no, I know this is what I want to do. But I was in West Virginia and didn't know how to get out, and so I went to school in Illinois for a bit because they'd offered me an assistantship, and then I could act out there. And then eventually a man, making a short story long, but recommended me for an audition up in Chicago. And then I went to the Barter Theater in Virginia, and then I went to the Cleveland Playhouse, and eventually I went to New York. And I was doing some off Broadway things. Had just finished a thing with the late Hermione Gingold, I believe. So had done a few things, and then got the call to come on to Dark Shadows. Basically, though, all of my training up to that time had been in theater, on the stage. I had done very little. I believe even I did Flatboat Man, but I did that even while I was doing Dark Shadows. So Dark Shadows was the first, you know, television or anything like that that I had done. We got to the studio, which was again on West 53rd Street, at 8 o'clock in the morning. There was always a display, not a display. There was always a whole collection of donuts and that sort of thing. And I had my favorite, and I always remember this because it was a roll and had nuts on top of it. So I was always trying to, you know, get to it before anyone else did, or at least cut it in half and hide half of it, you know, so that I would have it there after we finished our, you know, we would read it after we do our block through. So 8 o'clock in the morning, we get to the studio, do all of that, whatever, sit down. I think we read the script. Now, what we did the night before, we would have a read-through after the taping session of the, you know, when we did the show. Then we get undressed, sometimes not even get undressed, and then we go into the rehearsal hall, and we would read through the next day's script. Then you go home at night, learn your lines, come in to the studio at 8 o'clock in the morning, maybe read it again, and then we stand it up on its feet, and we would block through with Leila or Henry or whoever was directing at that time. Generally, it was those two stalwarts. And we would block it for, you know, there for camera, but just block it out up there in the rehearsal hall. Then we would take a break. And I don't recall whether we went down on the floor and blocked it for camera down there, or sometimes the cameraman came up in the rehearsal hall to watch, but then we would go downstairs and block through it. Now, some of us would have, you know, your makeup calls were staggered, do you know what I mean? So who was not in this scene, so they're in makeup or whatever, but eventually, we would block it for camera. We would all get made up. We'd all have our costumes on. And then we would go down. And sometimes we'd do a run-through without our costumes. You know, then we'd do a run-through of the show. And I think generally we only did one run-through. And by that time, you know, we had to, it'd probably be close to 3 o'clock or whatever, and we had to make final adjustments costume-wise, and then we went down and taped the show. Which was always an adventure in itself. Now that's sort of in a brief, you know, recollection what it was. It was very much live theater because we did it, as we say, on tape, but it was what we call quote-unquote live on tape, because we did not correct mistakes. We did not go back. The only way we stopped is if the teleprompter broke down, and then Jonathan might grind to a halt or something like that. But I could never use a teleprompter. I don't know why. I didn't like to use it too much. I worked it an entirely different way. I don't know that Joan couldn't use it because I don't think she could see it. I don't know. But we stood the chance of, as I recall at that time, if we didn't finish it on time, we'd lose the cameras we'd lose the tape apparatus to the news department, as I recall during that time. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I think there was something about that. We had to finish within a certain time. If we didn't, we lost the cameras, and we couldn't start up again till like 6 o'clock because they were taping whatever, the news for the West Coast or whatever. So, but seeing as how we did, now maybe Dan and the powers that be decided to do this on purpose, but all the mistakes were kept in. I mean, we never, I mean, it was a mad dash. I mean, you would do the run-through or whatever, and then we had like 3, 4, 5 areas of the studio. It wasn't a big studio, but it was big enough so that when you finished a particular scene here with this camera, and before the next scene started, whoa, you had to run dash, and sometimes you say, oh my God, where am I? What do I do? Where do I go? What scene? Oh yes, I'm this. So it had that kind of energy about it that was sort of half out of that's what it's supposed to be and half out of fear.
bloody fear of what do I say next, where am I going, all of this. And then sometimes you'd have Carlin under the camera, you know, making faces at you like that, and all of those kinds of things. But we never went back and to correct anything like that, unless the teleprompter broke. And that's all and the studio caught on fire one night. But we did not stop. I mean, we didn't stop. So it had that kind of feel to it. And whoa, you would be pumped. You would be nervous. Too nervous. You know, I was, you know, at times I was just, but it's quite terrific. It was quite nice too, in a way. It played into it. We were so right, and thank goodness I don't know the audience didn't know that. Oh my God, look at them! They've got such terror on their face, and the terror actually came from, well, what do I say next, or where do I go, rather than the actual terror of the character in the situation. But yes, it all worked. You could use it, as they say, use it. Well, one of the things that was fortunate, I mean, when I first went on the show, they had this gramophone there, and they played this music. And I believe Quentin's theme had been used once before, and I don't know whose idea it was to bring it back, or, I mean, maybe it had been used in a different context or something, but anyway. But they brought this, da, 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 dee, 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 and they would play it whenever Quentin, you know, came onto the show. So after a while, that began to have, you know, people identified, obviously, the character with the music. And as the show went on, then somebody came up with the idea of writing, the song was such a, you know, was fairly popular, and they decided to write words to it, Shadows of the Night. And then the song began, people began recording it. I believe Franny and Teicher, I think Andy Williams may have recorded it. There were various recordings of it, and it did quite well. And lo and behold, it was, Bob Hope had his theme song, and David Selby had his. I mean, I thought it was so, you know, in looking back on it, it was so special, because for a while, wherever I would go, people would get a great treat. In fact, today, I mean, I'll go somewhere and someone will bring out an old record and it'll be playing when I go in the house or something, and they're very proud that they found this, wanted to play it. But for the longest time, you know, wherever I would go, people would always bring it up. I would hear it in elevators, you know, and I remember being in Canada or somewhere and hearing it, you know, in a hotel elevator years afterwards. It just brought back a wave. It just washes over you, you know, all of the memories of that particular time. But how delightful and how fortunate that an actor would have a theme song. It just, you know, and I had the sheet music, and then we recorded that. I got a chance to record the thing for Phillips, I believe, and we did the LP, and I did the recitation of the words, Shadows of the Night, on the LP, and that was, again, quite special. And, I loved all of that. You know, again, you think, oh my God, it's all those things you don't expect. Who's to say, you know, when you go up and move a couple of golf balls on Dan's office and you do a scene from Summer and Smoke and he looks at you on camera, how are you going to know that later you're going to get 5,000 letters a week and they're going to send you a ton of Sara Lee cakes, you're going to have peace beads, you're going to have thousands of fans, you're going to have your own, very own theme song. Pretty lucky fella. Well, I think the appeal of Dark Shadows, people love a good story. People have been in love with Bram Stoker's Dracula. They love classics like Turn of the Screw or whatever. Dan, for all whatever reasons, was able to come up with a series of characters that, for whatever reason, translated to a lot of people on the other side of it, too. And that made all the difference. I think to a certain extent, the characters were so distinctive that sometimes they carried the storyline. Whether it was Carolyn or whatever, you know, when she played the vamp in the Blue Whale or whatever. Certainly Hoffman, Humbert Estreda's, Humbert's character, Jerry Lacey's Trask, Thayer David. I loved Thayer David. My God, did I love Thayer David. All of these distinctive, and probably going right from the beginning, before Quentin appeared on the show, so that combined with all the elements anyway that makes for a good Stephen King novel, Dark Shadows had the mystery, had the vampire, the sensual, sexual vampire. People loved those stories. And I think the combination of the fact that we had a sort of mini repertory company that, I don't know, the fans just tuned into these characters. And I think the appeal, maybe the appeal also had to do with that particular time, but I don't, because I think it's it could, doing the right thing. It could be very film-wise. It could have great success today, and it continues to. That's what's amazing. Those shows had such an immediacy to them, whether, as I say, in the fact that you were driven by fear or whatever. The shows have a certain kind of energy, and obviously sometimes there's a certain camp to the shows. People could look at them from all various kinds of directions or ways, but the appeal lies in this special world that Dan's imagination created, and the writers fulfilled, and the actors carried out. And they were successful in creating a world of its own, so that world today is still of its own, just as it was then. Dark Shadows is no more dated, in a way, today than it was when we did it. It's going to, I now believe that the show has a certain kind of eternity to it. It will go on because of how it's of its own world. Nothing comes into it. We don't see cars. We don't see, modern life. We never saw early computers on this show. We didn't have those kinds of things. There was no technology, even technology of the time. So I think to a certain extent it was very much of its own world, and was accessible enough that people could come into that world, and so much so that they could role play. They could be those characters in there.
Well, Jonathan was unlike any, it was full of fun, had a glint in his eye. I remember him saying, Jonathan, actually, how do you learn all those lines? How do you learn those lines? And actually, we'd have a discussion, I remember once in his dressing room about that. But, he was not like, and he was unlike any leading man. So Dan had created this character that was quite, the women really liked Barnabas, and he was, I don't know, he just had a persona that that was just so right for that, you know, time. And he was so much of a gentleman. And never once do I recall him ever, you know, saying anything or having an argument. I never had an argument. In fact, I never had an argument in the whole time I was doing Dark Shadows. Never had I don't recall having a disagreement unless it was with Henry, who was directing, or Leela, you know, because, oh no, I think I ought to do this. You know. Of course, they would always have the last word, because it was the voice of God coming to them. You could never see them when you were on the floor. You know, David, what are you doing out there? Oh, where? Oh, you saw that? Dear Grayson. Grayson I truly loved. Grayson was a mother figure for me. In a way, she took care of me, held my hand, you know, told me what to do, took me in as a friend, had me for dinner at their house, my wife and myself, over to, you know, their apartment on 7th, up there in by the Wellington Hotel at that time. Nobody like her. There was nobody like her, and there is nobody like her today. She was unique to herself. And I think to a certain extent people didn't know what to do with her. I'm not saying Dark Shadows, I'm saying the business as a whole. Theater, not theater, but or movies. She was very special. And God, what a laugh. Ah! God, so kind to me. So kind. Dear Louis. Another gentleman. Another gentleman. Although he would get quite proper about certain things, you know. Where he might say something right out and Jonathan may stew about it, you know. But Louis would, and Louis was always going to his house on Long Island at that time. I couldn't imagine. He's got a house on Long Island. And he loved a garden. And he just, again, it's the personality. And I think that was one of the things that the writers and Dan were able to capitalize on. They were able to take those distinct personalities, and we had some, besides wonderful talent, we had wonderful personalities. I mean, on that show. They were distinct personalities, and they had talent to back that up. And Louis's personality, they just put it right into that character. His gentleman quality, his properness, his correct way of whatever, the way he held his body, his whole demeanor. And I think the writers, after a while, they got to know us a little bit, and they certainly were able to, you know, to bring that. I mean, there's nobody else in the world except Grayson Hall who could play Magda. I mean, Julia Hoffman, Lara, Moon Eyes. I thought she was, when I first knew her, she was intimidating to me because she was so beautiful. She was absolutely just stunning. And again, I think that because they didn't know how do we utilize that kind of such beautiful eyes. I just always, inside I'd never tell her I called her Moon Eyes, but she was just beautiful. And her skin was like the moon. I just, every time and she'd grown up, and I think she'd appeared at the Front Street Theater down in Tennessee. And she was from that area, so we sort of, and then we got to know each other. And Lara has a kind of vulnerability that is rooted, once you know her, And I could appreciate that. And I don't know whether it's rooted in an insecurity that we all have, that I have and continue. Somebody said, well, yeah, you've had a certain amount of success or whatever. No. My insecurities have always stayed with me. But she had a vulnerability about her that that allowed me, and she was accessible. You know, she had such beauty that I just couldn't. But then we became great friends, and have fortunate enough to been able to again see each other, you know, occasionally. And what a character, Angelique. Angelique, like so many of the characters, was so distinct, and people just loved her. Loved her. Can't believe that Dark Shadows is coming upon its 40th anniversary. I mean, that is completely beyond my ability to understand. I think it's wonderful, and I should say that I think in some way I do understand it. Never when we were filming the show did we ever imagine, we just never, you know, could imagine that, you know, 40 years later the show would still have a life, and quite a wonderful life. And I think one of the reasons, Jim, that the show has hung on, and it has created such a special niche within people, young and old. You know, you'll see, goodness, you'll see people bringing their grandkids, you know, to watch. They're watching the show now. Is it somehow, and I've mentioned this before, I believe, but Dark Shadows was very successful at creating its own world, and that world was not reliant upon any, it didn't rely upon any, you know, particularly newfangled kinds of things. We didn't have computers, we didn't have automobiles or any of that kind of thing. We were just very successful, the show was, at creating this world in which we could all escape to. I mean, actors and audience alike. And somewhere along during the history of that show is that I believe actors and audience alike formed a kind of relationship that was very special. And this relationship was theirs. And it sort of took them out of maybe whatever day-to-day things that we all have to deal with. It allowed us to escape into this other world. And I think there was a true bond between the company of actors, actresses, and the audience. And it was this bond together, this relationship, that somehow allowed us to be a little positive about life. We looked forward to the next day's, you know, adventure within the story. So that's basically, that was my take on it, that somewhere, somehow, Dark Shadows was very successful in creating a very special bond between the company of actors, between Dark Shadows and its audience. And such a special bond that it is held in there today. I've had the occasion to go to a few of the quote-unquote conventions that they've had, where the Dark Shadows conventions, where all of the fans will gather to sort of celebrate in their, I don't know, celebrate the joy that the show was able to bring to them, and how it was successful in uniting all of these people. And it gives the actors a chance. One, it's sort of like an annual reunion, but it gives a chance for the actors to say hello and to, you know, spend some time with each other, because we were all so very we worked so intensely during those years together. So that is very good. But the special thing, I've been seeing some of these same fans for years, even since the show was on. And I just, it's always a smile. Not only at the convention, wherever I've gone around the country, if I walk down the street somewhere in some town, someone is going to holler, "Quentin." I was on the set of, we're shooting a new film here the other day, on Saturday, and a lady came up to me and just was, you know, boiling. It had such wonderful feelings about the show. And, you know, when you go to the conventions, you know, they dress up as the characters. They have a grand time. I think it's a very joyous kind of occasion. And that a show can do that, you can't ask for any more. That a show can touch you and touch the human condition and make the human condition a little joyful, a little more joyful, just for a brief period of time. It's something to be treasured. One of the most, I don't know how to phrase it, but one of the most special things that happens for the actors and the audience is that in this coming together is that for a brief moment we are able to create a joyous kind of feeling, you know, within. We can get away from the whatever our daily chores are that we all have to, you know, engage in. But for this time, we can escape into this world. And the fact that 40 years later, that the show Dark Shadows is still able to reach out there and grab a little bit of your heart and take you away into that world, so that all other, you know, whatever day-to-day things of life, they're sort of put aside for this world. And for that brief, very joyous and joyful moment, I think it's a moment, I know for me, and I believe for the audience alike, it's a moment to be treasured. And it's, in a way, it's not to be taken lightly, because you just don't find that kind of, you know, rapport, that give and take between the audience and that show, and that it's still going on all these years later is just a testament to that. The creative genius behind Dark Shadows was the one and only, how do you say that word? Inimitable, I can't even say it. The creative force, the driving force behind Dark Shadows was Dan Curtis. And somehow Dan was able to, you know, bring forth all of this. And Dan was almost, if not a professional golfer, he was very close to it, because as I recall, he had started one of the very first televised golf shows, if not the first. And that just goes, you know, one of the interesting things about it is when you look at somebody, you pigeonhole them, or you say, oh, he's a golfer. You know, how could he ever have come up with this other kind of, you know,
whether it's a dream he had or a nightmare or just his sheer imagination. So I would imagine when he first came up with the idea, it was a pretty hard sell because after all, he was pigeonholed as this or that. But what he was able to do is, was a quite wonderful thing, and dreaming up, this show, and then of course his borrowing, say, other classic stories such as Turn of the Screw, or a lot of maybe some of the hauntedness of Edgar Allan Poe, or a lot of those things, and then combining it with all the costumes, which were handmade. And by the way, and I believe the costume shop, as I recall, yes, it was right there, and they used to hand make all of the clothes, all of the long dresses, for the frock coats that the men wore, and then they had all of these antiques, so for the set pieces. So right away, the first day when I stepped on the stage, and one of the first things I saw was this old, as Quentin, was this old, I don't know, it was an RCA Victrola, with the dog and the big red megaphone. All of those kinds of pieces, the clothes, the costumes, the stories, and then the writers would sort of do riffs off of all of these famous stories, or Dan would come up with another one of his, oh, let's go here, or let's go back in time. And that may have been one of the greatest things, the fact that we could travel, And it all emanated out of Dan, and that's where Dan obviously, where he first started directing. I think that Dark Shadows is certainly a legacy, and it's his legacy that one should be, rightfully so proud of. The fact that all these years later, it is still bringing joy. It is still bringing joy to children, to adults, to teenagers, all these years later. When the show was about over, actually I was in the hospital because I'd had an attack of appendicitis. So the show actually went on for a couple of weeks, and I didn't film those last couple of weeks, but then we were in the process of taking the show and doing another movie, another Dark Shadows movie, with Johnny and Grayson and Nancy and Kate and Jimmy Storm. I think it was obviously financial decision. It was a bottom line decision on behalf of ABC at that time, probably. I have no doubt about the fact that they could probably do 5 or 6 game shows for what it may have cost Dark Shadows. Also, it may be that show burned so intensely and so brightly for those years that it was meant, to just go away, to just, go away. And perhaps the reason it stayed in the people's consciousness for all these years is because it burned so brightly and intensely, that it's, so that each one of those shows, you'll meet they can quote it to you, they can feed it back to you, because they've seen a lot of the episodes so many times. Fans know far more than certainly I do, or that I recall. Hello, I'm David Selby, and I've put together a special book called In and Out of the Shadows, containing over 300 color and black and white photographs from my career, with an extensive section devoted to my days as Quentin Collins on Dark Shadows. I've also included some poems I've written that reflect on my life as an actor that I hope you will enjoy. To order In and Out of the Shadows, please call or write to the address on your screen or visit davidselby.com. And thank you for watching Dark Shadows.